Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about a specific topic, which is Super Smash Bros. Melee and nostalgia. Specifically, nostalgia for kids born in the late 80s, early 90s, and why it's kind of that sweet spot where Melee and nostalgia are the strongest. And I have a few ideas why that is, and I'd love to discuss that. But before we do, I thought we should define what the word nostalgia means. And to use the dictionary definition, it is a sentimental, longing, or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. Now, what's so funny about nostalgia is, people can be nostalgic for tons of different reasons, and so many factors play into that, but I think video games in particular have a special foothold on nostalgia. And I think an example of that are the YouTube playlists that you find that are, 30 minutes of nostalgic Nintendo songs or something like that, where people feel very strongly and they really feel this passionate nostalgia for the video games they played, especially when they were younger. Another example that you can see of this is kind of how with GoldenEye's re-release on Switch and Xbox, you can see people getting so excited saying, man, that was the best. I can't wait. And, that's a game that never got a re-release officially until very recently. And so, whereas some of these other classics from people's childhoods have been re-released. You think of, Ocarina of Time got a 3DS remake. It also got re-releases on Virtual Console, etc. Right? So a lot of these all-star games from people's childhoods have had plenty of time to be re-released and then be experienced by later generations. But GoldenEye was not. So I wanted to throw that out there as an example. So the first aspect of Melee in particular that I really want to focus on when it comes to that nostalgia sweet spot is its time period. So it was just after the Nintendo 64 and just as GameCube launched. And it was that inflection point where Melee lives. And what's so funny about that is it literally straddles kind of this old era, like this one generation, like the N64 generation, and like the GameCube generation. And so the way that I personally feel as somebody born in the early 90s, I feel like the Nintendo 64 has the best games, pretty much. And then I think of GameCube as having is the console with the best sequels, if that makes sense. So to draw some examples, I would think about like Mario 64, considered one of the best games ever made. Zelda Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask. They're all N64 games, and they got sequels that are very well loved as well. Mario Sunshine is very well loved. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are very well loved, and I wouldn't consider them better than their originals on the 64, but they're very much loved by many. Star Fox 64, it got Star Fox Adventures, which is kind of a so-and-so. I don't really consider that a sequel. It's supposed to be a Dinosaur Planet. It's supposed to be a 64 game, but I consider Assault kind of that really stellar sequel to Star Fox 64. It's still not quite as good as Star Fox 64, but hopefully you get my meaning. And the last point I will make is Mario Party, I think, is another good example. I feel like 1, 2, and 3 are just pretty much the pinnacle of Mario Party. And then you have 4, 5, 6, and on 7. But even just if you take 4, 5, and 6, stellar sequels. I can see why they're the people's favorites of the series. But I don't think they quite edge out over 1, 2, and 3. So, wrapping it all back up to this inflection point, Melee is right smack dab in the middle of that. And when it comes to what Melee is, if you think about it, it's representing Nintendo at the time as well as the characters associated with it and sort of the franchises. And so because of that sort of best of N64 and best sequels GameCube dichotomy you have going on, what it means is the very best games are being represented. Now, with the case of Metroid, the latest game to have come out was Super Metroid. And people, again, widely regard Super Metroid as one of the, if not the best Metroid games. So you have Samus coming off of that game, and she gets kind of her representation through that. Through the Mario series, you have Super Mario 64, and Melee came out just before Sunshine. So all the characters from Mario, Peach, Bowser, Mario, Luigi, etc., they're all designed with the Mario 64 design. And actually, Yoshi as well is relevant, because what was interesting about Yoshi is Yoshi's story had come out a few years before Melee. And also this has happened in Smash 64, where Sakurai kind of stuck to his design from Super Mario 64 and like Yoshi's Island and Super Mario World, where he's kind of the more, rideable dinosaur, I guess to say. Um, Whereas in Brawl Forward, they went all in on his modern design, which is a little bit more standing upright and less dinosaur-like, if that makes any sense. Whereas Melee was kind of this interesting blend between he's using his modern sounds. He doesn't make his Mario Kart 64 sounds. He makes his, Yoshi Story sounds where he says his name and all that. But it's like the design more like the Mario 64 era. So anyway, and then also on the Pokemon side, you have Gen 2 as the most recent iteration. Pokemon Gold, Silver, Crystal had come out just before Melee. So one of the most beloved, well-loved gens of Pokemon history had just come out. And so also you have to remember, Rare was not purchased by Microsoft yet. So they were still alive and well and remembered freshly in the minds of fans. If you were a Nintendo fan, you were a Rare fan. And even though their representation was sparse in Melee, there are a few gems in there, like the Motion Sensor Bomb, which is a direct GoldenEye 007 item rip. You have Donkey Kong, who is very much associated with Rare. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little time capsule of what it was like back then, especially if you aren't necessarily of my generation. You don't really remember that time very well. The next point I want to explain that was indicative of that time period was the art style of Melee. So if you think about Smash 64 and Melee, every character was technically based on the same art style, but the difference is the engine. And that's the only difference. Other than that, they're the same art style. Every Smash game after that has kind of gone for their own art style. But the only difference you see, a big difference between 64 and Melee, was just hardware limitations. And to kind of explain what I'm saying a little bit more, hopefully in a way that I can point some examples. Think about Donkey Kong Country, how groundbreaking that was, where they rendered these high poly 3D models, and then they turned them into sprites, and that looked phenomenal. Well, that started this trend of using Silicon Graphics 3D models for promotional material. All the Donkey Kong Country games had all these, colorful, realistic looking for the time 3D models, whereas, if you think about A Link to the Past or you think about Super Mario World, those are very much still kind of illustrations, 2D illustrations, whereas kind of the way forward, we're using these 3D models, and that was absolutely present through the 64 era. Think about every Nintendo 64 game and those 3D models. And of course, that was kind of the new thing at the time. So by today's standards, they're definitely more rough because we've come so far in design and refinement since then. But if you look up the Render 96 project, that will give you a really good idea. It will kind of transport you back to that time to get an understanding of what I'm saying. And if you want an exact example of this, if you look at the Raccoon Mario trophy in Super Smash Bros. Melee, you can see that is just a repurposed flying cap Mario from Super Mario 64's artwork. And if you compare them, it's like this. They use the same model. They just lowered the poly count slightly to fit in game. So all that to say, you have this very specific art style, but now with the power of the GameCube, you had it realized in game. Donkey Kong Country doesn't really count because those were sprites. Mario Kart 64, similar. They were only sprites, although they had the same art style. Finally, with GameCube, though, you could actually do that. And this was just before Mario Sunshine, which again kind of changed the art style of Mario, Luigi, Peach, etc. And that kind of became their modern designs. Like if you look at Mario, Peach, Luigi's designs from today, and you trace them all the way back to their earliest design, I think you'll find that Mario Sunshine forward, Mario Party 4 forward, represent those new designs. Whereas Melee was kind of the final game with the older designs. And I'll show a few illustrations on screen, because one thing I want to draw attention to specifically is an early version of the Mario Party 4 box art. So here's Mario Party 3's box art, and here's Mario Party 4's box art. And you can see a common design language there. But with the final version of Mario Party 4's box art, you have this design. And you can see just in these images the more modern look for all the characters. And it's one that I don't like as well because it's not as nostalgic and I don't connect with it as much. I very much prefer the older design, like what you'd find on Mario Party 3. And that's really what I'm talking about here with Melee. The Melee design really based more heavily off of these older renders and these designs. So I think that's another reason why it has that nostalgic foothold for us. So that was going to be the longest section. I think the time period is really worth talking about to really understand that nostalgia. But there's other components to it that I think make it nostalgic. It's that high production value and that refinement. So again, I want to think about Smash 64 and Melee. Same art style, but they present very differently due to hardware limitations. If you use Melee's low poly models, you'll find they're very similar to the models used in Smash 64, even though they're still higher poly. And that just tells you how different, how much more sophisticated Melee came across compared to 64. And that alone, despite being based off of the same art style, was enough to really just, it was a way to make our childhoods a reality in a sense. If you grew up with the SNES and the N64, and you were just, staring at the box art and just, like looking into the game store and seeing all that stuff, and now you can finally play a game that has the characters that you saw in the box art really come to life in a way that almost mirrors it one-to-one. There's really nothing like that as a wow moment. I think the other part that can't be ignored, of course, are the streamed audio tracks in high quality, because of course you had limited sound fonts, and you had basically very obviously MIDI tracks in 64, but you could now have almost CD quality audio on GameCube, which made a huge difference in just how it was the presentation. And I can't talk about the controller enough either. So the timelessness of the GameCube controller cannot be understated. And if you really look at it, it really is a more refined, polished, improved N64 controller by any way you slice it. There's a few things with the C buttons that make it preferable to use a 64 controller versus the C stick, but there are very few other advantages to using the 64 controller. That control stick was so much better on GameCube. The LR buttons were so much better. You could actually access all the buttons without using a third handle. It just made more sense. And so I think, along with the visual presentation, the audio presentation, the visceral presentation of a rumble pack built-in, really solid controller, which, by the way, Nintendo has released 3 more times. Once in 2008 in Japan, another time for Smash 4 in 2014, and yet again in 2018 for Smash Ultimate. That gives you an idea of how fondly Melee is remembered for that controller experience. The next aspect I want to talk about is the complete package aspect of Melee. I remember getting Melee and feeling like, wow, this is a completely fleshed out game that I will never grow tired of, even as a child, because it had so much single player and multiplayer content. And I think what's interesting here is, Melee was the first everyone is here game before Ultimate, because they brought everyone back from Smash 64, which did not seem trivial at the time. And obviously the scope was smaller, but, they only had 13 months, so it wasn't really a given that all the characters would return. And remember, Brawl had, significantly more development time, and not even they brought over all the Melee characters. But I think you'll find people in the Gen Z generation regard Brawl very highly in this regard of it feeling like the complete package, because Brawl had so much content in it. But I think the first one to really do it was Melee. Melee really felt all the trophies, the adventure mode that drew from characters' franchises, and of course the event matches, all the trophies. Just there was so much to do for single player content, and of course for multiplayer you had the base game, which was fun as it was, but then you had all the special Melee modes, and it just felt like you could lose hours into it. Even the freaking camera mode within special Melee was so fun. And that's what I would say about the complete package aspect. The last thing that I'll say that maybe less people can relate to, but I've certainly met some people that do, so I'll bring it up, and it's the pre-lag era. So obviously HD TVs were not the standard really until maybe late 2000s, mid 2000s if you're generous. And so Melee, of course, came out just before this. But what that means is everyone was playing on CRTs with composite cables, and the word lag just didn't exist back then. I mean, it technically did. There was technically lag still back then, but it wasn't really an issue like it is now. There's a few reasons for that. One are the CRTs that I just mentioned. 2, there was no online play, so any online-based lag was simply not part of the discussion. And online gaming wasn't really a thing until Xbox popularized it, and that just happened like at the same year as Melee. So it wasn't really a given yet, except for some PC users who were used to it. There was no universal buffer mechanics. Like Brawl Forward, every Smash game has pretty severe buffer mechanics. And a lot of modern games have buffer to where it's essentially forgiving for your input. So if you're a few seconds early on your input, it doesn't eat your input. It just basically buffers it. And, you know, it's to kind of be a safety net if you don't get your timing exactly right. But that wasn't really a consideration for video games up until that point. If you missed the input, you missed the input. And so it really rewarded responsive gameplay. And to add insult to injury, one way that Brawl really highlighted this difference was, of course, adding the tripping mechanic, which is a meme now. But, you know, that's an example of deliberately hindering and punishing people that cared about responsiveness. And so I think even though the Wii wasn't an HD console or anything like that, it also underscored how laggy the game was. If you connected those composite cables to an LCD monitor, oh my goodness, the time to convert from, you know, to digital from analog was so long, and man, that was a terrible experience to play Brawl on an LCD compared to playing Melee on a CRT. Like the difference was completely night and day. So anyway, I think there's a subset of us that longed for the time where like lag was not part of the discussion. It was all very responsive, and there was no issues with lag. So this was a fairly long-winded video. Obviously, it wasn't scripted. I just had some notes on the right here that I've been looking at to give some context. But I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable. And do you feel nostalgic about Melee? Why or why not? I would love to hear the reasons in the comments that you feel that way. And I hope you get to see you guys on the next one.